Should we use a microservice strategy or should we use monoliths? And the answer is always, it depends, right? Yeah, it's like the context matters, right? Like the organizational dynamics matter a lot. We all know like the monolith success stories, and honestly, I love them, right? Like they make a ton of sense to me. There's other good arguments for monolithic apps too, especially as a software provider. If you're going to let people install your software locally, you almost have to be monolithic.
I'm surprised with the blowback on microservices recently. There's been a lot of pushback from developers that just don't like it anymore because of the complexities it brings. I was kind of shocked. For a while, it was down with the monoliths.
Episode 13.
Lucky number 13.
Crazy. There we go. So we'll just jump right in. Thanks for taking the time to chat today. We're going to talk about how to right size your applications, kind of the age old microservices versus monoliths, and talk through the process by which you decide how to right size your stuff, right? So
this has been done. Like this is not a joyful conversation that we would bring up just because we love to talk about and rehash old statements, but I think it deserves another look, especially in today's day and age with the AI agents and the bots and the new indexing of repos. That it begs the question of: are you still the right size? Are you too small? Are you too large? And kind of reevaluating your deployment strategy.
It's one of those classic annoying situations, right? Where someone comes and says, what do you think? Should we use a microservice strategy or should we use monoliths? And the answer is always, it depends, right? Yeah. It's like the context matters, right? Like the organizational dynamics matter a lot, right? And depending on if you're extreme as an organization, then like a 5-person startup, I mean, you can say pretty definitively a microservices strategy is not a good one, right? Like there's not a lot of benefit to that. But if you're a 5,000, person company or a 5,000 person technology organization, having a monolithic application is probably impossible. Not to mention not a good idea.
I think Facebook and Microsoft, they had to write custom editions of Git or their, version control just to handle the size of the repos. So it's just, the technology doesn't even support it.
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, and then repos is a whole other thing. Like I think Google was their whole company is in one repo, some bananas thing or something like that. So that's a totally other debate that we've obviously had internally as well. It's kind of a wild thing. And I mean, most engineers, right? Like especially the ones you and I interface with, work at, pretty good sized companies, right? Like they are, usually on a team of, 5 to 10 people, maybe part of a technology organization that's in the thousands and things like that. That's sort of our typical audience and our typical kind of constituents that we work with, and in that case, monoliths still are a struggle there as well, right? Like we all know like the monolith success stories and honestly, I love them, right? Like they make a ton of sense to me. GitHub, I think still is a monolith most largely.
A lot of places are.
The 37 Signals guys, Basecamp, all those things, like that's one big monolith. And there's other good arguments for monolithic apps too, especially as a software provider. If you're going to let people install your software locally, right? You almost have to be monolithic.
It's one install.
Yeah, the complexity of your platform is just too much.
I'm surprised with the blowback on microservices recently. There's been a lot of pushback from developers that just don't like it anymore because of the complexities it brings. I was kind of shocked. For a while, it was down with the monoliths. Pitchforks were out, but now it's kind of took a big turn, and I'm kind of surprised by that, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, you and I helped carry some of those pitchforks, right? Like we can't went into a startup in Passport. They'd gotten to where they were with a monolith, and we were pretty snotty about it, right? Like it's like, oh well, there's better ways to do this, and da 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 da. I think in retrospect, it's like, wow, actually, one, it's really cool what they were able to do. And we should have told them that how cool we thought it was more often, instead of just talking about the future. But also in retrospect, breaking those things out, there's pros and cons, but that refactoring process is expensive, right? Both in terms of time and focus and
maintenance. It's a lot of things that people don't consider is just the maintenance cost of microservices. And you get into an enterprise environment and it blows up with the amount of overhead that you have to carry on each individual microservice. There's the paperwork view that you have to take, and there's a lot to go into it. So I made the mistake at one place, and I kind of broke things into microservices a little bit too early. And then as processes changed, my day was a lot of just making sure that the compliance was in check. And, you got to make some decisions on that just to make sure that you're not loading yourself up with too much maintenance, and then you just can't get as much feature work done because you're maintaining.
Yeah. The number of components and applications and entities that exist. If you're in a company that has good strict, policies, whether it's SOC or HIPAA or any of the other frameworks or the stuff that the banks have to deal with, your administrative tax, like we talked about last time, right? Like just grows as a function of the number of assets or components you have, right? So if you have a system that could be one application or it could be 50, if you choose 50, you are increasing your compliance cost by maybe not 50x, but at least 20x, at least 30x. Right?
Yeah.
And so, that's a big part of it, right? That's a big part of it. And you see people game that too, right? Like we know of one group where it was one application and they had something like 60 microservices deployed under one application ID, right?
Right.
And that's not better. It's not a good idea.
Well, because it makes it hard, though, because it also makes it hard, and another way to maintain it. If you get a vulnerability attached to an app ID, well, now how do I find out where that was? Because you've just assigned it too broadly. And so now you can't maintain yourself and figure out, so you're putting in time somewhere else. But I think the point is that defining the metrics by which the right balance is there. And I think that it begs the question now of right sizing in the age of the AI agents. Now we see the benefits here in our repos that the more context you have, the better the results that you're getting in the suggestions. And that helps our capacity and throughput. Just so much more throughput that we're getting because of the AI agents and getting the context. And so I'm going through the process right now of consolidating some of our repos so that to give it the right context to make better decisions. But where do you think that goes too far, though? Because, just because the context windows on these agents are getting bigger, that doesn't mean the suggestions are going to get better the more information that you give it.
Yeah. I mean, it's so hard to forecast the AI functionality because it just changes so rapidly. But I think you come back to there's a couple of different forces that are sort of in play at the same time that I think matter, right? Like obviously Conway's law exists for a reason, right? Like we know that. Like basically there's organizations who design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structure of those organizations, which is a mouthful. But basically it means that your technology structure usually mirrors your org structure is another way to think about that, right? And there's a reason that ends up happening because service-oriented architectures and all those different things, basically what ends up happening is whatever the team size is where people are making intimate decisions, like where they're working with each other day by day, that is generally speaking the largest boundary by which you can have an application size effectively, especially in a large organization. Again, there's exceptions that disprove that, but in my experience, that's by and large what you're going to deal with, right?
Without putting some big rules and processes in place.
Yeah, exactly.
It's doable, but it just takes a lot of discipline and additional overhead to make sure that you're not stepping on toes. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, you have to modularize it, right? You have to do it very intentionally. Like we see it, like we talked with Chris a couple weeks ago, right? Like people do this with mobile platforms because ultimately you're building one mobile app. And so you need more than like a small team working on it. And so you figure out a way to modularize it and everybody gets their little part of the app and you stitch it together and then you build it into one thing like that. You end up having to do stuff like that. Obviously for backends, it's different, but that's effectively what ends up happening. So with that, but along with the AI stuff is I think there's two forces that contribute to that conversation, right? Is I think I think AI will help teams stay smaller, right? I think you'll end up with, hey, we own this domain. Instead of needing 30 people, we can do it with 10, or whatever the number is. I don't know what the ratio is going to look like. And the thing you're talking about, right? Like the additional context of instead of the agent having to know about 5 different repos because they're constantly, or 5 different services because they're constantly talking back and forth to each other and they're not really independent. They're sort of tightly coupled and all those different things, but they're tightly coupled, but not. And like what ends up happening with microservices, right? Like this is why microservices, like everybody sort of turned on them. I think the thing that, what was it? Uber ended up with something like 6,000 microservices. And everybody,
it was insane.
That was like the peak, and everybody realized, okay, we've gone too far. And then it's kind of come back since then. I think that was probably like 2019 when that came out, when everybody became aware of that. To me, that was sort of the peak of the microservices craze. But underlying microservices is service-oriented architectures, right? Which is fundamentally don't share data without an interface effectively. Like that's the way I interpret the guiding principle of that. And so like your bounded context is a team effectively. Now, what team size you want to do? Is it a squad? Is it, a platoon type thing where you have a team of squads? Or is it bigger than that? That's usually a choice. But to your point before, like you have to do a lot of work. If you're going to do bigger than a squad of squads, you have to do a ton of work to keep that together. And
I did that at one place and had to augment some capacity for a big project, and everybody was stepping on toes and pull requests and who's reviewing. It just becomes an absolute nightmare because at the end of the project, somebody's going to go back in this sense. If you have 2 teams always working, you're always stepping on toes. There's just, it's a mess.
Yeah. So ultimately it's not a technical thing, right? Like there are technical things. The bigger you make your app, like if you have a monolith, the bigger it is, the slower it's going to deploy, slower it's going to build. Like you have some technical realities to that. In our world, if you want to scale the smaller pieces you have, like if you have more discrete pieces, you have more levers to scale at. You can say, okay, I want to scale here, but I don't have to scale here. Versus if you're a monolith, like this is like when we were at Passport, it was a monolithic database, multi-AZ, but still monolithic database. And then a bunch of EC2 sitting in front of it, load balance, right? So like we had a couple of scaling levers. We could scale the database up. And then we could add more servers. Like that was it. But they were very, that was all we actually needed really. And maybe you don't need something more sophisticated than that. But in a lot of situations, it'd be nice to, if we could just add more memory to this one process, right? Like that type of thing. Like I only need a bunch of memory when I do this one thing once a day. I run this batch job, but it needs to load all this data in memory. Like I only need to do that. I don't want to upgrade the memory for the servers that are going to run 24 hours a day just for that. Like there's things like that where pulling things out can be really useful. And make that granularity can be really helpful, but it just depends again.
Yeah, one thing I don't want to conflate a repo to a service either, because that's a very common approach is you have one monolith that has one pipeline and you have many repos having one application each. There is a middle ground there, and it's easy to conflate service or app to repo because that's a very standard approach. But in the middle there, it's just to address the point is that there's a lot of challenges with that approach too. You're mentioning a monolith and one and scaling independently, but if you're deploying multiple repos, that's just as hard multiple apps in a single repo. That's just as challenging because you have to have independent pipelines for each individual app, and you're not redeploying app A when app B has made a change. So there's a lot of pipeline magic that has to happen to make that work too. That makes it just as challenging, which is why typically, it
makes me nervous.
It's terrible. I'm sure some DevOps person, if they're listening, would say, "Oh no, it's easy. Just check this." But if you don't really have an expert in that field, that's where it becomes very, very challenging to have multiple apps in a single repo that deploy independently. It's definitely doable, but it's harder.
Of all of our code, the one thing that I like, that I'm kind of the point person on that uses anything like this is we have this package monorepo, right? Where it's a bunch of either Go or JavaScript packages that then another that we essentially put into an artifact registry and then another process uses. And so there's no runtime with any of those. It's just basically bundling them up and putting them into, either GitHub packages or wherever they're going. And, and it's a nightmare, like keeping all that straight and keeping it, up to date and, making sure it's, like you want to share code between them because there's a lot of it, but then like, how do you do that properly? And how do you do the versioning properly? And, when do I know to kick it off? And all that type of stuff is just, it's a pain, right? Like, and that's, doing that with multiple runtimes in a single repo. I don't think we've actually tried to do that yet. That would make me nervous. I don't like it. So
I don't either. I'm usually the crazy one, but I don't like it either. And that's not something that I'm ready to do yet.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think back to your question though, right? Like, I think again, the AI stuff it has to stop changing before it can really change everybody else. I think. I mean, that's not entirely, but like, the rate of change is so high right now that it's harder for people to adopt it in a way where they say, okay, we're going to completely change the way we do business because we know what this thing is. Right now, it's like, it's changing so fast that like you might try to sprint to keep up with it and take advantage of it. But we don't actually know what the implications to the organization stuff is, to organizational dynamics are yet. Right. There's a school of thought that says that the transformer model is about to hit its ceiling, that these tools are really, really good, but they're going to flatten out. And, and then the next 10 years until they find the next big breakthrough. Right. I mean, I knows? I think that's a non-zero chance, but not necessarily the most likely probability, most likely outcome. But I have seen that pattern over and over again where it's like, while things are on kind of this hype curve, or not just hype curve, but change curve is so high, it's hard to adopt. It's hard for it to have the large scale impact to the way the organizations run. But I do think as it starts to stabilize, or at least the back part of the curve stabilizes, I do think what you'll end up with is, okay, we can do, like the bounded context will get smaller in terms of the number of people. And so I think you'll see more of a move to monoliths because you won't have 50 people that you need 10 different services so that they can properly work together.
You'll start to see some consolidation because it'll give it the right amount of context to be able to be effective. Now, there's no right answer here. We don't know. To your point, we just don't know where it's going to go yet. But if I'm going to throw the spaghetti at the wall and read the noodles on and I would say that you would likely see some consolidation. And so that you're not, especially with apps that talk to each other a lot, say, one team owns 2 microservices that talk to each other a lot. You would see those consolidate down so that even if they're still bounded by an API, they talk through that interface, having that context will allow the agents to be effective, to understand the contracts. You don't have to code as much in. So I can predict a little bit of that, I think, because that's what I'm seeing myself as I'm making and pulling some code in or pulling a repo in. It's like, oh yeah, that was enough context to make the task go faster.
Yeah. So where I push back on, like, I think you're absolutely right today, right? Like, I think that, and we're seeing that, right? Like, that's evidence of that. The question I would have is whether or not that will have a long-term impact because, or will it be more of okay, there's a targeted context, like instead of consolidating, like we did this for one of our things, right? Like we had this essentially data management process that had a bunch of data that was contextual, that was very useful context that you put into another app, right? Because it made the context of the app richer. You put it into another repo, I'm sorry, and it made the context of the repo for the agents richer. Moving forward, is that just a command where you just say, hey, these are related, and the agents will index or MCP or vectorize or whatever it needs to do the other repo as though it was part of this repo, and therefore it doesn't matter. Like that's the piece that I don't know. Like it seems like that's very feasible and very possible.
I would agree. I do agree with what you said there. So you wouldn't make any large scale organizational changes based off of that assumption. I don't think you'd collapse an entire department down into a single repo because of that. That would be too
well.
Much,
that is a technical impact too, right? Like that you were saying would cause problems if it was too big.
Right. So now is just a little bit at a time and start to chunk it. Okay, low risk things consolidation because hey, you pull it together now. There's nothing to say that, hey, this is now too big. Eject it to its own repo again if you isolate your code enough and don't fully integrate it. And I think that's at least the approach that I'm taking just to de-risk exactly what you said.
And again, I think you're absolutely right today. The question is the tools are changing so fast, their ability to take in new context, the models are able to take in more and more context. The cost of the inference is going down. Like all these different things, it's like, there's the behaviors you have to do to maximize the value right now.
Yes.
But like, what's it going to look like 6 months from now, 12 months from now, 18 months from now, 24 months from now, when big companies actually start adopting it, right? Like that's
I think
the question.
You're making decisions today for that reason. You're saying that like, I'm going to make this decision today to make the agent more effective. Well, you would integrate that in a way that keeps the risk low. So you wouldn't, fully federate out the two services. You would maybe put them closely, but able to be ejected off if you need to again. So a low risk integration versus a full adoption and absorption by the parent or the one that's getting adopted into.
So let's go a little micro for a second, just because we're AWS fanboys, right? Containers versus serverless. We've already got into that, but like, how does this conversation? Like, how do you change your calculation about how to size things, whether if you're using Lambda versus Fargate or something like that, right? Like, if you're like, how does that affect the calculation? Or do you need to make one decision? Do you need to make one decision first, right? Like, which decision should you make first, or should we make them at the same time?
I don't think that's a hard one to answer, to be honest. I thought about that. We have containers that could go together. We could deploy and put them into individual tasks in ECS, but I don't know if it's that easy of a decision to make because that could overly complicate your deployment as well. Because now it goes to the statement we were making earlier about, well, you're merging these two containers together. Well, now how are you deploying those? Are you deploying them as one, as two? Did you make the deployment so large because now your pipeline is taking 30 minutes to deploy? I don't think that's overkill, right? That's
it's like the old Java world, right? Like I remember at B of A, and I'm going to get them backwards, ear versus war. One went into the other. I forget which one, but so the architecture was, they had tons of jars that they would build that each other would consume. That was, the jars was almost their SOA approach, right? So they would say, okay, I'm going to build the service information for this particular type of thing, stick it in a jar, and then each individual like BU area would have a war, and then it'll all get bundled up into it, like, so they'd have 3 build steps, right? Like in the different repos or whatever, that all get bundled up into this one big ear or war. Again, I can't remember which because I never really paid attention because it was Java. And then that's what actually got deployed, right? So it was a very monolithic deploy with a lot of little components that got stitched together over time, which I thought, which is an interesting approach, but to your point, it's a lot of orchestration.
And it takes so long. It moves you from individual atomic deploys. Like, I want to just deploy this one thing. And now you've got a multi-step process that makes your deploy take hours, where it could, if you have it small enough, what the right answer to small enough is, that's not what I'm here to answer, but whatever makes the most sense to get you to production the quickest. And that's, I think, the right answer. And there's just there's so many nuances and context to that's something that you just had to figure out by app, what makes the most sense. But going, kind of pushing on what you just mentioned, that's too far. If you get to that point, you have officially gone too far.
It's funny. My perspective on all this is I liked microservices. I pushed microservices. My personal preference, all things being considered, all things being neutral, held constant, is you should use a monolith until there's a hard reason you can't. right? And then peel off away from it, not don't intentionally break up a monolith. That's not, I've tried that. Don't recommend it. If you want to do a monolith, you peel off individual things. So like a Passport, this is one of the things we did that worked great. There was a bunch of processes. So the way the app worked is it had multiple processes running on the server, the main PHP app, but then we also had like an MQ process or something like that. I forget exactly what it was, where we would make things go asynchronously, right? Like they didn't want them to be blocking tasks. So we put it in that, and then that would call itself. It would call the server. It would call, through a route and run the process. And we were like, all right, well, we could pull that off into a Lambda, right? So instead of dropping it into an MQ and then having that compute come back and hit the database or the server again, we dropped it into the queue. That queue fired off a Lambda and it did the task that needed to happen. So like there are things like that you can do to start to peel off little bits and slices. But the question I was getting at was like, if you think about Lambda, so again, our architecture, right? Like our main app is a monolithic Lambda, right? Kinda, right? Like so yeah, like the main part of the app is in a one big Lambda. And then
microservices. One repo gets split out to multiple Lambdas that you got a REST API in one, you got a GraphQL in another, but I like the term macroservices.
Yeah. Or I like mini services too. That's a good one. The point is in between, right?
Yes.
So it's like, I guess if people are trying to make the decision, like on the one extreme, okay, cool. We've got this monolithic app. It's, we're going to have, or I've got this domain, the customer domain or something like that, where I'm building one app, one service, one API route area. But I'm going to do it in serverless. I'm going to do it in Lambda. How do I make the decision between a single Lambda that has all the code that everything's bundled up into versus route level Lambdas, which we've seen as well, right? Where it uses the same code, but just packages up different Lambdas based upon the route. And then in betweens, right? Like, how do you advise teams to make those calls?
Yeah, I can't speak to everybody, but I can speak to what I did and why I did it and why I started to consolidate some of our Lambdas into one. So, I had more of the route-based Lambdas at first, and that was fine. It worked, but there was a lot more maintenance on that approach than I wanted to do. And so now every time I wanted to expose a new route on a REST API, I had to, not even just a new route, but even a new HTTP method. It involved changes to our CloudFormation serverless file, of course, the API docs, and then create multiple new files to expose the handler. And so that was a decent amount of overhead for creating a new route. And so instead of having 30, 40 Lambdas that now have to deploy independently, I collapsed it down into a single REST API Lambda that was a proxy endpoint to the rest of the Express app onto the hood. And so that took me from, I think it was 15 Lambdas down to one. The deploy time shrank because I'm not deploying all these extra Lambdas. My storage in AWS reduced a bit, not significant, but a little bit. But the management was the biggest part that was easier, and I had much less cognitive overhead to look at a single file that has all my routes in it versus one file that has all the routes and splitting up into individual apps under the hood. And so the code base shrank by doing that, and the maintenance and the management and the overhead of that was a lot easier. And so now I could have a more consistent approach by not having to be so verbose just to expose one new HTTP method. It just went from, like I said, 15 potentially Lambdas to one that gets handled. But also then the reuse of the Lambda was helpful as well with the database connections, with reusing the Lambda for, the cold starts. It got better. Let's just say that.
Yeah.
So I can't give you the right answer.
It's not being fragmented.
Right. And so I can say that worked for us for those reasons. But those are the things to look at when you're making that decision of your deploy time, your your overhead on your teams, the cognitive overhead, the deploy strategy, all those are factors into deciding, should I consolidate or should I keep a more fragmented approach, or to what level is that right consolidation?
So, and what's the benefit of the fragmented approach, right? Like the only benefit I can think of off the top of my head is tuning of concurrency and timeouts and things like that, and size, memory, like memory footprint. Are there other benefits to fragmenting it like that?
You get more fine grained control. You do. If you want to have an individual Lambda, you can have. So you've got a very memory intensive. I think you made this point a little earlier. Is something that's very memory intensive on a single endpoint. Well, you have it all in one Lambda. You're sizing to your biggest usage. But we didn't have that case where we have a lot of data crunching it's a very simple CRUD REST API. So we just didn't need that level of granularity. So collapsing it had no effect on the performance. If anything, it potentially could have helped, because now we're able to not, have all these Lambdas spin up independently if somebody's consuming multiple. They're reusing.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. I think the other, because we kind of like think to wrap, to me, Amazon, AWS just got everything right in a lot of ways, right? Like, I think that there's two rules that they have that are instructive in this conversation. Like, one is the 2 pizza rule, right? Your team, you shouldn't try to have a team that's bigger than 2 pizzas that you can feed with 2 pizzas. Which of course, depending on the person, is pretty wide range, but
I can eat a lot of pizza.
Yeah, exactly. But setting that aside, gluttony aside, I think that one, and then combined with, the early injunction that Bezos put out that said, hey, you have to treat each other, the different teams, like your external partners, like that real service oriented architecture principle. Like, you don't get to cheat and use backdoors and all that type of stuff. Which is really enforcing that bounded context, I think set the stage for them to be as successful as they've been. And I think, if you follow those 2 principles, I think you're generally going to be in good shape, is sort of my impression. And, lean into the Conway's law type of thing. That's fine. Like, you don't have to try to buck the system. But at the same time, like, keep your teams, because the reality is you can't, if you've got more than 10 or 15 devs working on the same like API, like you're not going to make that. You're going to have so much diminishing returns, right? This is where like the mythical man month type of concept, right? Like you gotta focus better and figure out ways to break it up at that point, because you just have to, because if you want to make more progress with more bodies, right? So that's my take, at least.
No, so. I agree. There's no right answer. It's a right answer for the team, what you're looking to do. It's just asking the right questions of why I should or why I shouldn't. And if there's more in the favor of doing it, do it. It's easy to go back if you need to. Yeah, for sure. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, man. Appreciate the time. This is good. Yeah, good chat. Likewise. And we'll talk soon. Thanks, everybody. All right. See ya. That's a wrap for this episode of Tech Council, brought to you by DevGrid. Thanks for joining us as we dive into building smarter solutions for the enterprise. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe, leave us a rating, and share your thoughts on X, at DevGrid Inc., or at devgrid.io. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll explore more ways to thrive in the enterprise. Until then, keep building.